To truly understand what this war is about, you have to look past the headlines and focus on what actually changes realities on the battlefield. From the very beginning, much of the coverage has been driven by emotion, imagery, and political framing, but that approach hides the mechanisms that really decide outcomes. Today's analysis looks at the war between Russia and Ukraine from a strategic angle, stripping away spectacle to examine what this conflict reveals about Washington's calculations and the political, military, and industrial system operating behind the scenes. Over the weekend, thick columns of black smoke rose over Crimea after a Ukrainian one-way drone struck a fuel facility in Sevastopol. Almost immediately, questions followed. Was this attack encouraged, or at least politically enabled, by recent remarks from U.S. officials suggesting that Crimea should be treated as a legitimate target? Or was it simply retaliation for recent Russian missile strikes? What is clear is the factual reality. A so-called kamikaze drone hit the site and ignited a single oil storage tank. That detail matters. The refinery itself remains operational. The exact number of drones used is unknown, but the damage was limited. Context is everything here. The fuel stored at that facility is not directly tied to Russian ground operations inside Ukraine. It does not power armored offensives or provide close air support at the front. From a military standpoint, the impact was negligible. The destruction of one tank does not meaningfully disrupt Russian logistics. Alternative storage exists and operations continue. At best, this was a symbolic action designed to be seen rather than felt. What truly matters, however, is not what burned on camera, but what happened quietly over the following 48 hours. Russia has clearly shifted its targeting priorities. For months, Russian forces focused on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. That phase was followed by systematic attacks on Ukrainian air defense. Ukraine never possessed a fully integrated air defense system comparable to Russia's, and what capabilities it did have were steadily degraded. The objective was straightforward: achieve air superiority based on most available indicators. That objective has now been met. We are now witnessing the next phase. Russian strikes are hitting a new class of targets, signaling preparation for larger-scale ground operations once terrain conditions allow. Over the past 2 days, Russian forces struck ammunition concentrations, armored vehicles, and troop formations. One of the most significant blows hit a rail yard in Kramatorsk that Ukraine had converted into a major ammunition depot. Roughly 200 tons of munitions were stored there. That stockpile no longer exists at a time when Ukrainian supplies are already under severe strain. This was not a marginal loss, it was a major operational setback. Alongside that strike, Russian forces destroyed between 20 and 40 armored vehicles. Whether they were on rail cars or positioned nearby remains unclear, but their destruction is confirmed. Even more serious were attacks on 9 Ukrainian brigade headquarters. Available reports indicate that around 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. This is not about tallying casualties for emotional effect. It is about understanding what these losses mean. Ukraine is facing a growing shortage of experienced operational officers. Many veteran commanders were already eliminated earlier in the conflict. These strikes did more than kill personnel. They disrupted command structures. Entire brigades lost leadership cohesion. There is also a strong possibility that NATO-aligned personnel were among the dead. The presence of British, American, or French advisors operating at increasingly tactical levels would not be surprising. Western involvement has been moving steadily closer to the front, regardless of official denials. This is one of the realities shaping the war, independent of how it is presented publicly. Meanwhile, across the Dnipro River near Kherson, Ukrainian forces had repositioned S-300 air defense systems, including launchers and tracking radars, supported by Gepard anti-aircraft guns designed to counter low-flying aircraft and drones. All of it was destroyed. Radars, launchers, and support systems were taken out of action. Without these assets, Ukraine cannot provide air cover for maneuvering forces in that area. From an operational perspective, these strikes were devastatingly effective. This contrast defines the current moment. Media attention locks onto a dramatic image, a fireball over Sevastopol, while the real story unfolds far from the cameras. One scene delivers visual drama, the other determines the direction of the war. Understanding that difference is essential for understanding everything that follows. When attention stays fixed on burning fuel tanks and spectacular footage, what actually determines outcomes on the ground is quietly obscured. The explosion of a single storage tank may generate powerful images for television, but it does not shift the balance of power. That facility was not a critical node feeding Russian offensives. It did not sustain air operations or enable armored advances. At most, it was auxiliary infrastructure, one tank among many. From a strategic perspective, the refinery continues to function. The operation was symbolic, a staged military act presented as something far more decisive than it truly was. This pattern is familiar. Time and again, even the most limited Ukrainian actions are framed as turning points. When Russian forces withdraw from a village, often because holding it offers little tactical value, headlines quickly declare a Ukrainian victory. Yet across largely flat terrain dotted with settlements of minimal strategic importance, such adjustments mean very little. In many cases, they reflect deliberate repositioning rather than collapse. The media narrative rarely captures that nuance. The deeper story lies in the precision of Russian strikes and their intelligence advantage. Russian forces demonstrated detailed knowledge of the locations of Ukrainian brigade headquarters. That level of accuracy is not accidental. It points to deep penetration of intelligence systems. While the United States and its allies supply Ukraine with high-quality intelligence, including satellite imagery, signals, interception, and surveillance data, results have been uneven. Ukraine recently managed to strike a Russian headquarters, but when placed alongside events on the other side, the imbalance is obvious. 9 Ukrainian headquarters destroyed, more than 1,000 casualties, compared to a single Russian target hit. The disparity is difficult to dismiss. This is not merely about access to information. It is about the ability to act on it. Intelligence alone does not win wars. It must be converted into coordinated action, supported by logistics, training, and experienced leadership. That is precisely where Ukraine continues to show vulnerability. Leaked Pentagon documents suggested casualty ratios of 1 Russian soldier for every 7 or 8 Ukrainians. Even if those figures are only partially accurate, the implications are severe. Ukraine is being systematically depleted. Attrition on that scale is unsustainable. This brings us to the question of linking battlefield developments directly to statements by U.S. officials, particularly figures like Victoria Nuland. She does not issue military orders and does not wear a Ukrainian uniform, but dismissing her influence entirely would be naive. For years, she has been central to shaping U.S. policy toward Ukraine. Her role in pushing both Kyiv and Washington toward deeper confrontation with Russia is undeniable. Whether or not she intended specific attacks, she represents a leadership class responsible for the direction this war has taken. There is another development that has received surprisingly little attention in Western media. Around the first anniversary of the conflict, Russia reportedly deployed a hypersonic missile, possibly a Kinzhal, in an attack that may have struck a NATO-linked underground facility. Reports suggest significant casualties, yet coverage has been minimal. Verification has been difficult. Some sources place the strike near Kyiv, which aligns more closely with known Russian targeting patterns, while others claimed it occurred near Lviv. What is known is that no public announcements have been made regarding the repatriation of American casualties. That does not rule out discrete returns. The silence itself raises questions. Media silence is rarely accidental. There is a narrative to protect, and reports of NATO casualties inside Ukraine do not fit neatly within it. Despite this, the broader reality is becoming harder to ignore. Ukraine is losing this war. This assessment does not come only from voices aligned with Moscow. Senior military officials from neighboring NATO countries have said so openly. Poland's chief of the general staff has repeatedly stated that his country no longer has sufficient ammunition reserves to sustain even a short conflict with Russia. Much of its arsenal has been absorbed by support for Ukraine. More importantly, he has rejected the caricature of a Russian military that is incompetent and disorganized. His description is very different: capable, disciplined, and resilient forces. This directly contradicts the image often presented in Western media of poorly trained soldiers and collapsing command structures. As is often the case, reality is more complex and far less reassuring. At the same time, figures like Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner Group, add another layer of complexity. His public statements are provocative and disruptive, but they also reveal political ambition. All signs suggest he is positioning himself for a role in post-war Russia. His rhetoric appears less concerned with battlefield truth and more focused on self-promotion. Yet Vladimir Putin's tolerance of these outbursts is not accidental. Prigozhin's criticism applies pressure on conventional commanders without Putin having to intervene directly. It functions as an internal pressure mechanism, allowing political distance while enforcing accountability. All of this points to a system under strain, but not in collapse. That distinction matters. As the war moves into a new phase, the actions of President Putin reinforce the same interpretation. His visits to frontline areas in the south and near Belarus are not symbolic gestures or simple photo opportunities. They are strategic signals. The message is direct. Large-scale operations must be ready to begin as soon as the ground hardens and allows for major movement. When Prigozhin publicly complains that neighboring units are advancing too slowly, it is easy to see that frustration as aligning with pressure coming from the very top. In that sense, Prigozhin functions as an uncomfortable but useful instrument, pushing the system forward without Putin having to issue public reprimands within the formal military hierarchy. This dynamic reflects tension, but it also reflects control. There has also been a significant shakeup at the top. The head of logistics was recently removed after reports that the FSB uncovered corruption involving stolen engines from the T-14 Armata tank program. Corruption in Russia is not new, but the timing of this dismissal is revealing. It suggests the Kremlin had known about the issue for some time and chose to act now, likely under increasing pressure from Putin and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov. This was not a panicked reaction, it was a calculated correction. In Western analysis, the removal or death of senior officers is often interpreted as a sign of instability. In Russian military culture, it often means the opposite. When generals are dismissed, it sends a message of accountability. When they are wounded or killed near the front, it reinforces the idea that leadership shares risk with the troops. This dynamic tends to build loyalty rather than undermine it. Over the past 14 or 15 months, Russia has removed several senior commanders. These actions do not signal collapse. They indicate adaptation under pressure. They reveal a deeper pattern in how Russia manages a prolonged conflict. Eliminating ineffective leadership strengthens the perception that the system is responsive and under control. Internally, it sends a clear warning that incompetence will not be tolerated even in a war of attrition. Externally, it projects the image of a state actively directing the conflict rather than being dragged by it. Whether one agrees with Moscow's objectives or not, this approach has helped preserve cohesion. In a long war, cohesion is not a minor detail. It is one of the factors that ultimately decides outcomes. A recent video circulating on social media highlights another aspect of the war that is frequently misunderstood. The footage shows a Wagner armored personnel carrier struggling through deep mud near Bakhmut. The vehicle fights to move through waterlogged terrain that appears almost impassable. For many Western viewers, such images reinforce the idea of Russian dysfunction, but that interpretation misses the central point. Mud affects everyone equally. It slows Russian advances and Ukrainian counterattacks alike. Nature does not take sides. This terrain is effectively frozen the next major phase of the war for both forces. Despite these limitations, escalation continues. In the past week, Russia launched missile strikes on Kramatorsk that reportedly killed 26 people. In response, Ukrainian military leaders declared their intention to intensify attacks against Moscow. That statement raises a fundamental question. Do they mean Moscow as the capital city, or are they using the term as shorthand for Russian territory and military assets more broadly? The distinction matters. Russia's border stretches roughly 1,000 kilometers. Defending a perimeter of that length against infiltration or covert action is inherently difficult. Ukrainians and Russians also share significant ethnic and linguistic similarities. Many Ukrainians speak fluent Russian with regional accents that are barely noticeable. This reality makes infiltration possible. The real question is not whether it can be done, but what it achieves. Assume Ukraine manages to carry out a limited strike inside Moscow, perhaps a symbolic action, a small explosion, a damaged building. What would be the strategic value? It would almost certainly harden Russian resolve, justify retaliation, and accelerate escalation. From a strictly military standpoint, the cost-benefit balance is questionable at best. Symbolic actions rarely compensate for material losses on the battlefield. This line of thinking leads directly to a deeply troubling debate unfolding in Washington. Some U.S. lawmakers have begun advocating for the transfer of cluster munitions to Ukraine. This proposal reveals a profound misunderstanding of both the war and its long-term consequences. Cluster munitions are not precision weapons. They are designed to saturate wide areas with small explosive charges. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of submunitions scatter across large zones. The danger does not end when the fighting stops. Between 10 and 15% of these submunitions fail to detonate. They remain in the ground as improvised mines. The United States knows this problem well. During the 1991 Gulf War, U.S. forces used cluster munitions extensively. After the conflict, unexploded submunitions killed and maimed soldiers and civilians alike. Children were among the most frequent victims. Introducing such weapons into Ukraine would leave a lethal legacy lasting decades. The humanitarian cost would far exceed the duration of the war itself. Presenting these weapons as a solution shows how far policymaking has drifted from human reality. As the conflict drags on, that disconnect is not shrinking. It is becoming more dangerous. The escalation debate cannot be separated from the reality of attrition, and it is here that the numbers become impossible to ignore. Current estimates indicate that Ukraine has lost more than 10,000 armored combat vehicles since the war began. That figure alone should force a moment of serious reflection. Armored vehicles are not easily replaced, especially in a country whose industrial base has been heavily degraded and whose supply chains depend almost entirely on external support. The obvious question is what Ukraine has gained in return for losses of that magnitude. Territorial changes have been limited and often temporary. Politically, the country is more dependent than ever. Strategically, its position has weakened. From Moscow's perspective, this reinforces the belief that its approach is working. In a war of attrition, the advantage lies with the side that possesses greater industrial depth, larger manpower reserves, and stronger internal cohesion. From Washington's point of view, continued aid helps maintain the appearance of momentum. In practice, it fuels a cycle that drains Ukrainian capacity far faster than Russian capacity. Every destroyed vehicle becomes justification to send another. Each shipment opens a new line of defense contracts for the American military-industrial complex. For Ukraine, the war is devastating. For others, it is profitable. This contradiction was exposed during a recent congressional appearance by General Mark Milley. When asked why he continued to believe in an eventual Ukrainian victory, he pointed to Russian armored vehicle losses. At first glance, the answer sounded reassuring. But when weighed against the reality that Ukraine has lost over 10,000 armored vehicles while Russia has not suffered comparable losses, the logic collapses. Confidence unsupported by facts stops being analysis and turns into performance. In contrast, General Christopher Cavoli, NATO's supreme allied commander in Europe, offered a far more revealing assessment. He acknowledged that there is little concrete evidence showing that Russia's armed forces have been severely degraded by the war. He then shifted attention toward naval and submarine warfare, likely to avoid dwelling on uncomfortable conclusions. Still, the message was unmistakable. The idea of a crippled Russian military does not align with observable reality. This represents a subtle but important shift. Increasingly, officials are introducing inconvenient truths into public discourse, even if indirectly. They understand that credibility requires acknowledging facts that no longer fit the dominant narrative. The uncomfortable truth is that this war was never only about defending Ukrainian sovereignty. It was also intended to weaken Russia so thoroughly that it could no longer project power beyond its borders. That objective has failed. Russia has absorbed pressure, adapted its tactics, and in several areas improved its operational effectiveness. At the same time, Western leaders are beginning to send quiet signals that Ukraine's prospects are bleak. These signals are not delivered through official statements, but through anonymous leaks. The tone is changing. A recent report suggests that President Zelensky was given an ultimatum: launch a counteroffensive or begin negotiations that include territorial concessions. If true, this presents an impossible choice. A large-scale offensive under current conditions would likely result in catastrophic losses. Negotiations, on the other hand, would be framed as betrayal. That is not strategy. It is abandonment disguised as choice. Former CIA analyst Ray McGovern stated this bluntly. In his view, Zelensky will not remain in power for another year, not because of direct Russian action, but because he would be removed by NATO interests or by Ukrainian nationalist forces. According to this assessment, Putin would not need to intervene at all. Zelensky's fate would be decided by those who once supported him or by those who believe he did not go far enough. When looking at his political trajectory, the pattern is familiar. Like many Western-backed leaders, Zelensky was elevated quickly, presented as a symbol, and promoted as a solution. Before politics, he was an entertainer, a performer whose appeal rested on populism and media presence. He was backed by powerful oligarchic interests and ran on a platform centered on peace, especially ending the conflict in Donbass. A crucial detail is that he is a native Russian speaker, a signal of reconciliation to a deeply divided electorate. Once in office, that platform vanished. The promise of peace gave way to hard nationalism aligned fully with Western strategic goals. Whether that shift was voluntary or imposed remains debated. What matters is the outcome. Voter expectations were abandoned, and the country was pulled into a war for which it was not structurally prepared. As pressure mounts, Zelensky's political survival grows increasingly uncertain, along with the stability of Ukraine's governing system itself. This instability extends beyond a single individual. It reflects a broader pattern seen in governments that come to be viewed as instruments of external agendas rather than representatives of their own populations. Once that perception takes hold, legitimacy erodes quickly. Whether Zelensky is removed through political maneuvering, pushed into exile, or eliminated by more extreme means, the underlying tension will remain. The core issue is trust, and once trust is lost, no amount of foreign backing can fully restore it. This brings us to a question that extends far beyond Ukraine itself: the future of NATO. For years, the alliance has been presented as unified, indispensable, and coherent. Yet this war has exposed fractures that were already present beneath the surface. At one point, it was suggested that the conflict in Ukraine might fracture NATO, or at least transform it in a fundamental way. The evidence now suggests that this process is already underway. A revealing moment came during the recent meeting between French President Emmanuel Macron and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Macron publicly stated that France would not automatically follow the United States into a war with China over Taiwan. This was not a casual remark or an improvised comment. It was a direct challenge to the assumption that NATO members will align unquestioningly with Washington on every major strategic issue. By saying it openly, Macron broke the appearance of consensus. What followed was just as significant. Poland, traditionally viewed as one of NATO's most hawkish members and a strong supporter of U.S. leadership, hinted that Macron might be right. The implied message was unmistakable. Perhaps Europe has relied too heavily on the United States for its security, and perhaps that dependence has gone too far. These are not fringe voices. They are central actors within the alliance. This debate is not new. During Donald Trump's presidency, European leaders were bluntly told to stop relying on American military power and increase their own defense spending. The tone was harsh, but the argument was simple. Why should American taxpayers indefinitely fund European security? European leaders rejected the delivery, but rarely the substance. Angela Merkel even suggested that Europe needed to chart a more independent path. In practice, however, nothing changed. Defense spending remained low, and dependence on the United States continued. From a purely rational perspective, this behavior is understandable. If a powerful ally guarantees your security, regardless of your own investment, the incentive to spend more is weak, strategically short-sighted perhaps, but economically comfortable. The problem is that this model leaves Europe strategically immature. Real autonomy requires real responsibility, and that only emerges when guarantees weaken or disappear. If the assumption that the United States will always intervene is removed, European states will be forced to adapt. That adaptation will not be quick or easy, but it will be unavoidable. Otherwise, NATO risks becoming an alliance in name only, a collection of flags and headquarters without shared purpose or political will. Will NATO survive? Possibly. But survival is not the same as relevance. The alliance may continue to exist institutionally while losing the ability to act as a unified military force. This war has accelerated that trajectory. It has shown that European interests do not always align with Washington's priorities, and that hostility toward Russia has often been adopted rather than strategically examined. A future European security framework could look very different. It would not need to be anti-American, but it would no longer be dictated from Washington. It would not automatically treat Russia as an existential enemy, but instead respond to Europe's geographic, economic, and political realities. That vision, however, cannot materialize under the current leadership class. As long as figures like Olaf Scholz govern with caution bordering on paralysis, as long as Macron speaks of autonomy without breaking from old structures, and as long as the United Kingdom behaves as though it still occupies the geopolitical position of 1945, meaningful change will remain limited. Leadership matters, and at this moment, Europe lacks leaders willing to confront these realities fully. Across the Atlantic, limitations are no less significant. In the United States, deep change rarely occurs without crisis. As long as the economy appears stable and the financial system functions, there is little incentive for the public to question entrenched policies. Only when the illusion of prosperity breaks, when economic pressure becomes unavoidable, does political reality assert itself. Until then, inertia continues to drive wars like this one, not out of strategic clarity, but out of habit and continuity. That, more than ideology, explains why this conflict persists.